The gleaming halls of the Galactic Military Academy towered above the planet's surface, their white spires reaching toward the twin suns overhead. Inside one of these towers, Professor James Walker adjusted his simple black uniform and took a deep breath. As Earth's first weapons instructor at the Academy, he knew the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. The door to the faculty meeting room slid open with a soft hiss. 6 alien faces turned to look at him, their expressions ranging from mild curiosity to barely hidden disdain. The room fell silent, save for the quiet hum of the environmental systems. "Ah, the human instructor has arrived," announced Dean Bright, his translucent skin glowing faintly with blue bioluminescence. "Please, take a seat. We were just discussing the new semester's curriculum." Walker sat down at the oval table, noticing how the chairs had been designed for beings with very different body structures than his. He nodded politely to his fellow instructors, taking note of each one's reaction. Professor Tall, a 4-armed instructor of energy weapons, barely acknowledged his presence. Next to him, Professor Green, who taught shield technologies, made a show of checking her datapad. The others simply stared, as if watching an exhibit in a zoo. "As I was saying," Dean Bright continued, "Professor Walker will be teaching our new course on, what was it called again?" "Primitive Weapons Studies," Walker replied calmly, ignoring the quiet snickers from around the table. "Though I prefer to call it Alternative Combat Systems." Professor Tall couldn't contain himself any longer. "Dean, with all due respect, I fail to see why we need to waste valuable teaching time on obsolete technology. These projectile weapons the humans use are nothing more than metal tubes that push bits of metal with explosions. It's barbaric." Walker smiled slightly. He'd expected this reaction. In fact, he'd been counting on it. "Sometimes the simplest solutions are the most effective, Professor. Not everything needs to be powered by antimatter or wrapped in quantum fields." "Ha!" Professor Green's scales rustled as she laughed. "Are you suggesting that your primitive slug throwers can compete with our phase-shifted plasma rifles? Or perhaps you think your explosive powder is more sophisticated than our directed energy weapons?" The dean raised a hand for silence. Now. The Council of Worlds has admitted Earth into the Galactic Federation, and part of that agreement includes cultural exchange. Professor Walker's course will provide our students with historical perspective. Walker leaned back in his chair, maintaining his professional demeanor. He'd spent 15 years in Earth's military before becoming an instructor, and he knew the value of patience. Let them underestimate him. Let them dismiss human ingenuity as primitive. They would learn soon enough. "I look forward to sharing my knowledge with your students," Walker said diplomatically. "I think they'll find Earth's approach to warfare quite educational." Yes, the dean waved a luminescent hand dismissively. "You'll have access to Training Hall 7 for your demonstrations. It's our oldest facility, but it should be more than adequate for your needs. Now, moving on to more pressing matters." As the meeting continued, Walker noticed Professor Tall whispering to Professor Green, both of them glancing his way and smirking. He pretended not to notice, instead making notes on his tablet about the modifications he'd need for his first demonstration. The meeting ended an hour later, and Walker was the last to leave the room. As he walked down the corridor toward his quarters, he passed a group of alien students who stared at him with a mixture of curiosity and superiority. He heard one of them mention Deathworlder in what they thought was a quiet voice. Walker smiled to himself. In 3 days, he would give his first lecture. In 3 days, these beings who thought themselves so advanced would learn why humans had survived on their harsh, high-gravity world. They would learn why primitive didn't mean ineffective. And maybe, just maybe, they would learn to stop underestimating the creatures they called Deathworlders. Opening the door to his quarters, Walker walked over to the locked case he brought from Earth. Inside lay the tools that would shatter the Academy's preconceptions about human warfare. It was time to prepare for class. Training Hall 7 buzzed with excitement as students filed in for Professor Walker's first lecture. The room, despite being the Academy's oldest facility, still gleamed with polished metals and smooth surfaces. Holographic displays lined the walls, and 3 rows of seats rose in a semicircle around the demonstration area. Walker stood at the front of the hall, a simple metal case resting on the table beside him. He watched as the alien students settled into their seats, their whispers and laughs echoing through the room. In the back row, he noticed Professor Tall and Professor Green slipping in, probably expecting to witness a failure. "Good morning," Walker began, his voice clear and strong. "Welcome to Alternative Combat Systems. Today, we'll examine what you call primitive weapons and why they've remained effective despite thousands of years of technological advancement." A student in the front row raised one of their tentacles. "Professor, my family produces energy rifles for the Galactic Defense Force. Why should we waste time studying outdated technology?" Walker picked up what looked like a simple metal tube from his case. "This, students, is what we call a shotgun. It's been in use on Earth for over 500 years, with only minor improvements to its design." He held it up, letting them see its plain appearance. Laughter rippled through the classroom. One student in particular, sitting near the middle, spoke up. "That looks like something from a museum. Our personal shields can stop anything that primitive." "Really?" Walker smiled. "Would anyone like to demonstrate their shield technology?" The confident student stood up. "I'm wearing the latest model shield generator. It can stop plasma bolts and energy beams with ease." "Perfect. Please, come down to the demonstration area." As the student made their way down, the door opened again. Dean Bright entered, his skin glowing with interest. "Ah, Professor Walker. I hope you don't mind if I observe your first class." "Not at all, Dean. In fact, your timing is perfect. We're about to conduct a practical demonstration." The student activated their personal shield, a faint shimmer surrounding their body. "Ready, Professor. Though I doubt that ancient tool can even reach me through this shield." Walker nodded and walked over to a shelf holding various targets. He picked up a watermelon-sized fruit and placed it behind the student. "The shield works by detecting energy signatures and creating a barrier against them, correct?" "Of course. It can stop any energy weapon in the galaxy." "But that's just it," Walker said, loading his shotgun with careful movements. "This isn't an energy weapon. Please stand still and keep your shield activated." The room fell silent as Walker raised the shotgun. Some students leaned forward in their seats, while others covered their sensory organs, expecting a loud noise. Boom! The shot rang out, causing several students to jump. The shielded students stood frozen in shock as the buckshot passed straight through their impenetrable shield, spreading out behind them to shred the fruit into pulp. "How? That's impossible." Professor Tall stood up from his seat. "Those shields are certified by the Galactic Defense Force." Walker cleared the chamber and set the shotgun down carefully. "Your shields are designed to stop energy weapons, plasma, lasers, particle beams, but simple kinetic projectiles, small pieces of metal moving at high speed. They pass right through because your shields aren't calibrated to stop something so basic." The classroom erupted in chaos. Students began talking all at once, some excited, others frightened. Dean Bright's skin had turned a pale shade of white. "This is just the beginning," Walker continued, raising his voice slightly to be heard over the commotion. "Today's demonstration shows why you should never underestimate technology just because it seems simple. Sometimes the most basic solution is exactly what your enemy won't expect." He looked around the now silent room, meeting the wide-eyed stares of his students. "Now, who's ready to learn about the real capabilities of human weapons?" Every hand, tentacle, and appendage in the room went up. News of the shotgun demonstration spread through the academy like wildfire. As Walker entered the testing chamber the next day, he found it packed with not just his students, but faculty members and even military observers from 3 different species. Dean Bright stood at the entrance, his skin flickering between shades of blue and white. "Professor Walker, the Galactic Defense Force has requested a more thorough demonstration of human weapons capabilities." "Of course," Walker replied, wheeling in a larger case than before. I was planning to show them something special today anyway. The testing chamber was massive, easily 100 meters long, with various shield generators and armor plates set up as targets. Professor Tall stood next to the control panel, his 4 arms crossed. "We've upgraded the shield since yesterday," Professor Tall announced. "Multiple layers, alternating frequencies. Nothing primitive will get through these." Walker nodded, opening his case. He pulled out what looked like a longer metal tube with a scope on top. Several alien observers laughed at its simple appearance. "This," Walker said, "is what we call a sniper rifle. It fires a single projectile designed to penetrate armor." He held up a large bullet for all to see. "This particular round is armor-piercing. Notice the tungsten core." Professor Green scoffed from her observation post. "Projectiles. Again. We've already increased the shield density by 300%. "Let's test it then," Walker suggested. He pointed to the far end of the chamber. "Those are your strongest ship-grade shields. Class 7 defensive barriers," Dean Bright confirmed. "The same type used on our battlecruisers." Walker loaded the rifle and took position. The room fell silent except for the quiet hum of the shield generators. Through his scope, he could see the multiple layers of energy fields shimming in the air. He squeezed the trigger. Crack! The sound echoed through the chamber. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. Then the observers noticed the hole. A perfect circle burned through every layer of shielding, and a deep impact crater in the reinforced wall behind. "Impossible." Professor Tall rushed to check the readings. "The kinetic energy. The speed. This can't be right." Walker cleared the chamber and stood up. The round was traveling at about 3 kilometers per second when it hit. The tungsten core was designed to maintain integrity at those speeds. Simple physics. A military observer, their scales bristling, stepped forward. "But our sensors, they didn't even detect the projectile." "That's the beauty of kinetic weapons," Walker explained. "No energy signature to detect. No way to track it until impact. Just pure momentum and material science." The room erupted in concerned murmurs. Dean Bright's skin had turned almost transparent. "Professor Walker, are you saying that human ships could be carrying these weapons?" "Every human ship has at least one railgun," Walker confirmed. "Similar principle, just scaled up. The projectiles are about the size of a small car." The horror in the room was palpable. One of the military observers was frantically sending messages on their communicator. "But wait," a student called out. "Surely these weapons have disadvantages. They can't all be this effective." Walker smiled. "Of course they have limitations. Every weapon does. That's why we maintain a variety of options." He reached into his case again. "Now, who would like to learn about what we call explosive ammunition?" Several observers took involuntary steps backward. Professor Tall's arms all dropped to his sides. Dean Bright looked like he might faint. "Remember," Walker continued, "this isn't about proving superiority. It's about understanding that different approaches to warfare each have their place. Your energy weapons are incredibly advanced. But sometimes," he held up another round, "sometimes the old ways are still effective." The testing chamber fell silent as Walker prepared his next demonstration. In the observation booth above, someone was already drafting an urgent message to the Galactic Defense Force about seriously reconsidering their assessment of human military capabilities. The Academy's main lecture hall was filled to capacity 1 week after Walker's initial demonstrations. Students from all years had packed in, along with military officials from 12 different species. Even the cleaning staff had found excuses to stay and watch. Walker stood on the stage, a large covered object behind him. The whispers in the crowd died down as he began to speak. "Today we're going to talk about something that seems to worry many of you: human artillery." He pulled the cover off, revealing what looked like a scaled-down cannon. "This is a model of what we call a howitzer." Professor Tall, now sitting in the front row, raised 2 of his arms. "We've studied your orbital scans. "We've never seen weapons like this on your ships." "That's because they're not on our ships," Walker smiled. "They're buried underground, hidden in mountains, disguised as industrial equipment. A single battery of these can launch projectiles over 40 kilometers." The crowd burst into worried discussions. A military official stood up, their crystalline form glittering with anxiety. "But our scans would detect such weapons." Walker shook his head. "No energy signature when inactive. No exotic materials. Just precisely machined metals and explosive propellant. We've been hiding weapons like these since before we discovered electricity." He touched a button, and a hologram appeared showing the internal workings of the howitzer. "The principles are simple. The complexity is in the execution. We can fire guided shells, armor-piercing rounds, or my personal favorite." He paused for effect. "Cluster munitions." "Cluster munitions?" Dean Bright asked from his seat, his skin now a pale gray. "One shell splits into hundreds of smaller explosives," Walker explained. "Imagine the shotgun demonstration, but each pellet is a high explosive charge, and we can blanket an area the size of this academy with them in minutes." The silence in the hall was deafening. Walker could see military officials frantically taking notes. "But surely," Professor Green spoke up, her scales rattling nervously, "such weapons are limited by ammunition. Our energy weapons can fire thousands of times without reloading." Walker nodded. "True, but we solved that problem centuries ago." He switched the hologram to show a factory. "We can manufacture ammunition anywhere. Any human colony with basic industrial capacity can produce thousands of rounds per day. No exotic materials needed. No complex energy matrices, just metal, chemicals, and precision engineering." A student in the back raised their tentacle. "Professor, why are you telling us all this? Aren't these military secrets?" "Because," Walker said seriously, "the biggest mistake in warfare is underestimating your opponent. The Galactic Federation needs to understand that humanity's primitive technology isn't primitive at all. We've spent thousands of years perfecting these weapons." He switched off the hologram and looked around the room. "Every human weapon you've seen so far has been over 100 years old in design. Imagine what our new ones can do." The implications hit the room like a physical force. Dean Bright's skin had lost all color. Professor Tall's 4 arms were trembling slightly. The military officials were huddled together, speaking in urgent whispers. "Next week," Walker announced, "we'll discuss something really interesting. Human guerrilla warfare tactics. How to hide armies in plain sight. How to turn civilian infrastructure into military assets. And why humans are so good at fighting against technologically superior forces." As the crowd filed out of the hall, Walker overheard a military official speaking into their communicator. "Cancel the invasion plans. I repeat, cancel all invasion plans. The humans aren't primitive, they're just better at hiding their teeth." Walker packed up his equipment, satisfied. Sometimes the best defense wasn't showing your strength, but revealing it at just the right moment. And the Galactic Federation had just learned that humanity's primitive weapons were anything but obsolete. The Academy's dining hall fell silent as Professor Tall stormed in during lunch period. He marched straight to Walker's table, all 4 arms clenched into fists. Behind him, a crowd of students and faculty gathered, sensing the coming confrontation. "You've made a mockery of this institution." Professor Tall's voice boomed across the hall. "Your demonstrations are nothing but tricks and theatrics." Walker calmly finished his coffee before responding. "Everything I've shown has been standard human military technology. Nothing special." "Lies." Professor Tall slammed one of his hands on the table. "I've studied the records. Energy weapons are the peak of military technology. Your crude projectiles cannot possibly match their sophistication." Dean Bright hurried over, his skin flashing warning patterns of red and yellow. "Gentlemen, please, this is hardly the place for—" "No," Walker interrupted, standing up. "Actually, this is perfect. Professor Tall, would you care to put your beliefs to the test?" The alien professor's eyes narrowed. What do you propose? A practical demonstration. Your best energy weapons against my primitive arsenal. Let the students see for themselves which is more effective in real combat scenarios. The dining hall erupted in excited chatter. Professor Tall's skin turned a deeper shade of blue with anger. You dare to challenge the most advanced weapons in the galaxy. Tomorrow, the main testing range. Walker smiled. Unless you're not confident in your technology. Agreed. Professor Tall practically spat the word. I will show everyone the true superiority of advanced energy weapons. The next day, the testing range was packed. Word had spread quickly, and even military observers from nearby systems had arrived to watch. The range had been set up with various targets and obstacles, simulating different combat scenarios. Professor Tall stood proudly next to his array of energy weapons, sleek, glowing devices that hummed with power. These represent the pinnacle of galactic weapons technology. Self-targeting plasma rifles, quantum disruptors, and molecular destabilizers. Walker had brought a simple duffel bag. He pulled out what looked like a black rifle with several attachments. This is what we call an AR platform weapon. Been in service for over 100 years. First test, announced Dean Bright from the observation booth. Accuracy under electronic warfare conditions. The range lit up with interference fields. Professor Tall's energy weapons sparked and flickered. Their targeting systems scrambled. Walker simply raised his rifle and fired, hitting every target perfectly. Impossible. Professor Tall switched weapons. The interference should affect all targeting systems. Iron sights, Walker explained. No electronics needed, just good old-fashioned mechanical aiming. The tests continued. In dusty conditions, the energy weapons beams scattered, while Walker's bullets flew true. In rain, the plasma weapons shorted out, but the rifle kept working. Through smoke, underwater, in high gravity, the simple human weapon proved more reliable every time. Final test, Dean Bright announced. Multiple target engagement in urban environment. The range transformed into a cityscape. Professor Tall's energy weapons were beautiful to watch, sending colorful beams of destruction everywhere. But Walker's rifle was faster, more precise, and didn't give away his position. When the simulation ended, the score was clear. The human weapon had outperformed the advanced alien technology in 8 out of 10 scenarios. Professor Tall stood in shocked silence. The watching crowd murmured in disbelief. The lesson here, Walker addressed the audience, isn't that human weapons are better. It's that simplicity has its advantages. No matter how advanced your technology, sometimes the basics are still the most effective. As the crowd dispersed, Dean Bright approached Walker. The Galactic Defense Force will want a full report on this. Everything we thought we knew about warfare. It needs to be reconsidered. Walker nodded, cleaning his rifle with practiced ease. That's why I'm here, Dean. To teach that true advancement isn't about complexity. It's about effectiveness. 1 month after the weapons challenge, the Academy's largest amphitheater was transformed into a special presentation hall. Military leaders from 27 species had gathered, their attention focused on the stage where Walker stood next to a large holographic display. Today, Walker began, we're going to discuss something that makes all our previous demonstrations look simple, combined arms warfare. He activated the hologram, showing what looked like ordinary human vehicles, trucks, cars, and construction equipment. The alien audience looked unimpressed. These, Walker continued, are what we call civilian vehicles, but with minimal modifications. He pressed a button, and a hologram changed, showing the same vehicles transformed into weapon platforms. They become mobile artillery, anti-air platforms, or armored personnel carriers. A military commander stood up, their crystalline form sparkling with concern. Are you saying humans can turn civilian infrastructure into military assets within hours? Hours? Walker chuckled. Try minutes. We've been preparing for war since we first learned to make tools. Every human colony is designed with military conversion in mind. Those grain silos, missile shelters, shopping centers, bunkers, highway systems, aircraft runways. The hologram shifted to show a typical human city transforming into a fortress. The alien audience watched in stunned silence as ordinary buildings revealed hidden defensive positions and underground tunnels. Professor Tall, who had been unusually quiet since the challenge, raised a trembling hand. But our scans, our intelligence reports, show exactly what we want them to show. Walker finished. Remember those primitive projectile weapons? Here's what happens when we add modern technology to them. The display changed to show what looked like a normal bullet. Then it split apart, revealing smart guidance systems, electronic warfare suites, and miniaturized explosives. This single round can change course mid-flight, hack enemy systems, or detonate with the force of a small nuclear weapon. And yes, we can mass-produce them in those primitive factories I showed you earlier. Dean Bright's skin had turned completely transparent with shock. Professor Walker, are you telling us that human military capability is far beyond what we initially assessed? No, Dean, Walker said seriously. I'm telling you that what you've seen so far isn't even our current technology. Everything I've demonstrated is at least 50 years old. Declassified. Outdated. The room erupted in chaos. Military commanders were shouting into communicators, academic officials were frantically taking notes, and several species representatives had simply gone pale or changed colors in fear. Walker raised his hand for silence. But the most important lesson isn't about our weapons. It's about understanding that true military power isn't about having the most advanced technology. It's about using what you have effectively. He switched the hologram to show historical human battles. We learned warfare the hard way, fighting ourselves for thousands of years. Every weapon, every tactic, every strategy has been tested in blood. We don't use primitive weapons because we can't build better ones. We use them because they work. A young student at the back raised their appendage. Professor, why are you revealing all this? Aren't you afraid we'll use this knowledge against humans? Walker smiled. Everything I've shown you is public knowledge on Earth, available in any military history book. The real secret isn't in the weapons or the tactics. It's in the human spirit that drives us to perfect them. The hologram showed one final image. Earth, seemingly peaceful from orbit. We're not showing you our capabilities to threaten you, Walker concluded. We're showing you so you understand why humans make better allies than enemies. The silence that followed was profound. In that moment, the Galactic Academy realized they weren't just learning about weapons. They were learning about survival from the masters of warfare themselves. The Galactic Academy's graduation ceremony looked very different this year. Where once the massive hall had been decorated with displays of advanced energy weapons and shield technology, now there were exhibits showing the evolution of human warfare alongside alien technologies. Professor Walker stood at the podium, looking out at the graduating class. 6 months had passed since his first demonstration, and everything had changed. In the front row, Professor Tall sat with 2 of his arms holding a tablet, the other 2 taking notes, a far cry from his initial dismissive attitude. When I first arrived here, Walker began, many of you thought humans were primitive. Dangerous, yes, but technologically inferior. Today, as you graduate, I hope you understand why that assumption was wrong. He gestured to the new display cases. The Academy's curriculum has been completely revised. Energy weapons are no longer taught as the pinnacle of military technology, but as one of many tools in a larger arsenal. Dean Bright, his skin now permanently tinted with respectful blue patterns, stood up. Thanks to Professor Walker's insights, the Galactic Defense Force has reported a 300% improvement in combat effectiveness. By combining human tactical knowledge with our advanced technology, we've created something entirely new. Walker nodded and pressed a button. The hall's holographic system activated, showing scenes from recent training exercises. Human instructors worked alongside alien military forces, teaching them to use simple tools alongside their energy weapons. The results were impressive. But the most important lesson, Walker continued, wasn't about weapons at all. It was about thinking differently. He picked up what looked like a simple metal knife. This blade design has remained unchanged for thousands of years. Not because we couldn't improve it, but because it's perfect for its purpose. Professor Green, who had once laughed at human weapons, raised her hand. Professor Walker, I've been studying human military history. Is it true that your species developed most of its weapons technology without using advanced computers? Correct. Walker smiled. We didn't have AI to design our weapons. We didn't have quantum computers to calculate trajectories. We used observation, trial and error, and most importantly, practical experience. The hall fell silent as Walker pulled out his old shotgun, the same one from his first demonstration. This weapon taught you that simple doesn't mean primitive, that basic doesn't mean ineffective, and most importantly, that true advancement comes from understanding fundamental principles, not just adding more technology. Dean Bright stepped forward. The Academy Council has made a decision. Starting next term, Professor Walker will be the head of our new Combined Warfare Department. All students will learn both human and galactic military techniques. The announcement was met with enthusiastic applause. Even the military observers at the back of the hall were nodding in approval. Remember, Walker said as he concluded his speech, humans didn't become dangerous because we had the best weapons. We became dangerous because we learned to use every weapon effectively. From sticks and stones to antimatter bombs, we mastered them all. He looked out at the graduates, seeing understanding in their eyes. You're the first class to graduate with this new knowledge. Use it wisely. Remember that the most dangerous weapon isn't the most advanced one. It's the one your enemy doesn't expect, doesn't understand, or doesn't respect. As the ceremony ended, Walker watched the graduates filing out, many of them carrying both energy rifles and human-style projectile weapons. They spoke excitedly about combining different technologies, about learning from the past while building the future. Professor Tall approached him, all four arms extended in respect. You've changed everything, Walker. We thought we were teaching you about advanced warfare. Instead, you taught us what warfare really means. Walker smiled, picking up his old shotgun one last time. Sometimes the best teacher is the simplest one. Now, who's ready to learn about human hand-to-hand combat? The eager response from the crowd proved that the Galactic Academy had finally learned its most important lesson. Never underestimate any technology, no matter how simple it appears to be.